Welcome you all. Thanks for being here. I'm very happy I barely made it with the big flu. I've been struggling with this for 10 days and still not going. But I'm very happy to be here for this occasion. That is, of course, doctoral defense of David Odorisio, and the work is titled Alchemical Hermeneutics, Revisioning Religious Studies Through a Jungian Lens. My name is Jorge Ferrer, and the chair of this dissertation, and I serve as core faculty here in Yoga Psychology. And our second member is Professor Craig Chalquist, who is the department chair of Yoga Psychology and teaches courses in eco-psychology, depth psychology. You all know him very well. He doesn't need introduction here. But the person who needs more introduction is external member is Peter Celestano, associate professor of Seton Hall University. Peter, would you like to say a few words about yourself? About your expertise, what do you do in Seton Hall University?
Sure. So I'm associate professor of the anthropology of religion, consciousness, sexuality, and gender. I specialize particularly in African-derived religions in the diaspora and mostly Haitian voodoo, Western esotericism, and Sufism and Christian mysticism, and mostly looking at, through the lens of consciousness study, the nature of people's mystical experiences. I also do research into the lives of gay men, particularly gay Catholic men, and their subversion of the communion of saints for their own purposes.
Well put.
Very good.
Thank you, Peter. That's fascinating. I wish you could be here at CIS.
Sounds great.
I think he does too. Yeah.
Thank you. So before I give the word to David, I just want to invite the audience to be here as present as possible. This is an important threshold in David's personal and professional life. He's becoming a doctor, he's becoming a colleague, and this is like a participatory event, as I call it, So it's David going through, but we are all together accompanying him. So your mindful presence, your attention, your support, I think it will be appreciated by both David and everybody here. So thanks for being here and for your mindful support of this event with your presence. And after that, just giving the word to David. He's going to present his work for about 45 minutes to 1 hour, and then the committee members will ask him some questions, some words of assessment of the work, and then there will be some time for the audience, hopefully, to engage him too, and then we'll come to give our verdict. So, David, just the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Jorge. Thanks, Craig. Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everyone, for being here, not just supporting me in this moment, but those of you that have really, there's a lot of people here from the 2011 cohort and Ishtar, people that have been here to really support me throughout my entire journey in the Bay at CIS, and I'm very, very grateful for your presence here. So alchemy for me is an embodied practice, so I'd like to begin with awareness and integration of the body into what I hope will be a very living and not disembodied experience over the last 2 hours. So I'd like to invite you to just take a very, very brief moment to find a comfortable seat. Bring your feet to the floor. Find a long and a tall spine. And just momentarily close your eyes and allow the breath to be soft. And notice where the breath lands in your body. Releasing any tightness or constriction, maybe in the low back, maybe in the lungs, relaxing the forehead. And in your own way, take a deep breath in and release. Letting go of any stresses and tensions from the morning, and bringing yourself fully aware and present in this moment. And with one hand, place hand on your chest or on the heart center. And with the other hand, allow it to just very intuitively be guided to any place or part of the body that might need healing. And allow that physical contact to bring an energetic awakening and opening to any part of the body that feels tight or closed. Bringing the energy of the heart throughout the body. And when you feel complete, seal that energy in a way that feels appropriate for you. Return to this space and just take a look around you, knowing that we are a community of scholars, of friends. None of us walks this path alone. We're all informed by each other in multiple ways of knowing, multiple ways of consciousness, not just with our minds, but with our hearts, with our bodies. Emotionally and fully present to one another. So I'm going to read something that many of you are probably quite familiar with. This is from the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, which is an ancient, very short alchemical text said to be of Arabic origin from the 7th or 8th centuries, but was eventually what became the center of Western European alchemy from about the 12th century on. True without error, certain and most true, that which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, to perform the miracles of the one thing. True without error, certain and most true, that which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, to perform the miracles of the one thing. Its father is the sun, its mother is the moon. The wind carried it in its belly, the nurse thereof is the earth. Its power is integral if it be turned to earth. Thou shalt separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the coarse, gently and with much ingenuity. It ascends from earth to heaven and descends again to earth and receives the power of the superior and the inferior. Thus thou hast the glory of the whole world. Therefore let all obscurity flee from thee. This is the strong fortitude of all fortitude, overcoming every subtle and penetrating every solid thing. Thus the world was created. Hence are all wonderful adaptations of which this is the manner. So as long as human beings have had a relationship to the earth, there has been an alchemy. It wasn't always called that. There were ritual practices that have existed since the beginning of human beings cultivating the earth. Whether that's in Chinese cultures, Arabic cultures, as far back as ancient Egyptian cultures, Greco-Roman, Indian, these cultures have all developed a way to work with minerals, with the fecundity of the earth, in order to impregnate what they began to eventually call a subtle body. So there's a movement from an external, extroverted practice to an internal internalization of what was understood as energies. So whereas in ancient cultures, there was an emphasis on the impregnation of minerals into the earth and the interplay of the cosmos with the very natural and organic microcosm. These later evolved into extremely sophisticated internal alchemical practice that we see in Taoist practices, in the Kundalini of Indian and Yogic Tantra, and then eventually in the further development in Europe, in European consciousness at the very tail end of 15th, 16th century alchemy, where the practices became more philosophical, that there was an understanding that the creation of a philosopher's stone, this integrated piece of immortality, was not just a thing that could be conceived materially, but it was also something that, as was ingested, was what the alchemist became. So there's an integration and an interpenetration of the external and the internal. Not that one is ever valued higher than other, although some alchemists did as it developed more into a philosophical system. But there's an emphasis on both, the inner and the outer, that we're working with materiality. We're working with the soul of matter in order to cultivate what could be considered our own souls, or what Jung referred to as the self. So what I've done in the dissertation is take this alchemical matrix, the procedures, the operations of alchemy, specifically focusing on Western alchemy, and applied that to various spiritual and religious texts from different cultures and different traditions. Now, for those of you that are historically minded, specifically in the world of religious studies, the first thing that you might say is, how was that ever be possible? How could you ever take a lens coming from a specific culture and a specific tradition and apply that to three different texts coming from completely divergent traditions in their own religious, philosophical, and cultural milieu? So that has been the underlying epistemological and hermeneutic challenge of the entire project. And that's what I'm going to unpack today. So I want to spend a lot of time with the alchemical hermeneutic, how I constructed it, what are some issues and some possible resolutions for that. And then I'm going to go into the texts and the way that each has been applied to see what the fruit of this hermeneutic has been. So why does this matter at all? Like Jorge's famous, so what question. So just a little bit of disclosure up front. This was an approach that came to me as an intuitive type. I did not come to it. It came knocking on my door. So when I go through this, explain to friends, people that are not of this world, what it is that I'm doing, they say, okay, I think that makes sense, but how did you possibly come to develop something like this? Well, it really came to me, and it came to me a long time ago when I was a master's student. I was doing my master's degree in the history of Christian spirituality, and I was reading these texts. I was reading mystical texts, one of the John of the Cross, which made its way into my dissertation, The Dark Night of the Soul. But I was reading the entire history, really the canon of the history of Christian spirituality. And I was learning it in a very traditional, historical, critical milieu. So we were incorporating these tools into a cultural critique of texts, where the outcome was supposed to be to place something as objectively as possible, to be able to remove myself as much as I can from a text in order that I can see it most clearly. At that time in my life, I actually believed that this was possible. I actually believed that it was possible to objectively and historically put something in the 12th century and think that I understood it. Now I know that this is not possible. It's not possible because of the reality of hermeneutics and the subjectivity of the interpreter, and that has led me to where I'll get to at the end, which is about the importance of self-reflexivity, the work of Jeff Kripal, and how we look at ourselves, how we place ourselves within texts so that it's a dialogue, that just like the alchemical practices have their internal and their external realities, when we're interpreting a text, we have to honor both the internal and the external realities of the text. So we have to look at the culture in which the text was created, and then we also have to do our own disclosure about where we are, how we're approaching the text, where we're coming to it. So that creates the hermeneutic circle and the cycle that we're going to look at through the lens of Western alchemy. Now, some definitions of what I mean by this. So alchemical hermeneutics, we're talking about a theoretical methodology in the interpretation of select religious texts. So what we're doing is the select texts are texts that I focused on in the dissertation that typically outline different states and stages of consciousness. So there's a transformation of consciousness that's happening in the text. So the Yoga Sūtras, for example, which outlines, in a certain sense, could be considered a very ancient depth psychology. The Dark Night of the Soul of St. John of the Cross, which outlines the stages of a soul's purgation, the purgative process, and then its ultimate union, reunion with the beloved, with God, and then the abandonment experience. So there's a constant, what we will look at is a separation and then a coming back together throughout the dark night that is very alchemical. The last chapter, the third paper, focuses on the concept of the heart in the Upaniṣads and in the Eastern Christian practice of hesychasm. So these are all forms of a yoga. So we're looking at the body then as a crucible of transformation. And they're all working with these different layers and states and transformations of consciousness. So I have found that that works best with how I'm using the alchemical hermeneutic. So what do I mean by the depth psychology piece, right? So we're looking at the interpretation of select spiritual texts through a depth psychological understanding. So that means that we're honoring the psyche. We're looking at the role of the unconscious. One of the things that was always missing for me in my very good but very traditional education in the study of religion is the unconscious. Freud has made his way into the mainstream religious studies, mostly through people like Ricoeur and through Jeff Kripal. But Jung has not. Jung has not, and we'll look at some of the issues of why that is later. But at this point, what I really want to lay is a foundation of working with the psyche and working with the unconscious in a way that Jung understood it. So it's not a Freudian reductive aspect of religion as a pathology, but we're looking at it from a Jungian perspective of religion as healing, which is true to the original sense of religare, religion, religare, to heal, to bring back together, to bind. And then the final piece is why alchemy? Like, can't we just do like a Jungian interpretation of religious texts? Like, people are doing that. Like, we could focus on a really solid Jungian lens. We could look at the text. We'd have two. It would be a lot easier. But the third piece is alchemy, and the reason for that is because, like Jung, I really think that the alchemical operations offer a much more subtle and sophisticated approach to the psyche. So Jung found in alchemical symbolism what he called a language of the psyche. And when we use these different alchemical symbols and operations, and we use them and apply them to interpreting a text, it really opens the text up in a much more richer and dynamic way that I've found increases our sense of meaning, what Gadamer calls an excess of meaning. And we'll look at what that means in a minute. So that's why alchemy, because there's a subtle sophistication that I've found within the tradition that I think really does open and expand the meaning within the text. So, some limitations and validity. So what is it not? So those of you who know the work of Robert Romanyshyn, who's a phenomenal depth psychologist who had a very long, fruitful career at Pacifica and a fruitful career before Pacifica, but he wrote this book, The Wounded Researcher, that some of you probably know, and he develops the term, it's the similar term, alchemical hermeneutics. The way that he uses the term is as a qualitative method for how we look at our research. So for Romanyshyn, it's an Orphic quest. It's the quest of Orpheus, where there's a descent into the psyche. There's a descent into the underworld where the researcher is, like the wounded healer archetype, searching for oneself through the text. Now that certainly is valid and legitimate in my study, and we'll speak to that later. But for the bulk, the three main chapters of the dissertation and the way that I'm exploring and sort of articulating this method, I'm really limiting it to a theoretical method, whereas Romanyshyn's is much more of a, which you could call even a clinical or a therapeutic approach to texts. So as I mentioned, I've limited to select texts that emphasize states, stages, and transformations of consciousness. And the validity piece was really powerful for me. For those of you in EWP that are in the PhD track, for your second comprehensive exam, it's a methodological sort of inquiry. And the fruit of that for me was really emphasizing and exploring this question of validity. And the way that I looked at it was, who has the right to define knowledge claims? Like, it really forced me to look at who gets to create knowledge. Like, who gets to create what we call scholarship? And that's one of the things that I love so much about this program, and what's been so freeing for me is the ability to explore different loci or focuses of consciousness. Is there a consciousness other than historical consciousness? Are there other ways to know a text or a person than where they came from? Right, so if we're studying, for example, the Cloud of Unknowing, which is a medieval text, Christian text, is it enough to know the culture and the context from which it arose? Like, that's very important. I want to know where it's come. I want to know who wrote it. I want to know what's the context. I want to know what's the culture. I want to know the spiritual and the religious practices that this person was doing when they were composing this text. But then what's the other piece? And this is what we can call archetypal or mythic consciousness. Right? What's my role in this? What's the larger collective role in this? How did this text have much more of a what we could call an unconscious import in the time that it was created? And then we can look at, why has this text resurfaced today? Craig always uses the example of the Nag Hammadi texts. Why was it in the 1940s and 1950s that these Gnostic texts exploded? There could be any time in history that these texts could have been uncovered. They were in caves, in jars, at any time. But there's something about the consciousness of the 20th century that something's been really moving towards a rebirth of Gnostic texts, towards mystical texts. So why is this happening now? So if we want to take the idea of Jung's idea of the collective unconscious seriously, we can look at both the unconsciousness and the collective of the 14th or 15th century, and then we can look at the collective unconscious and collective needs of today. So when we bring this archetypal or mythic consciousness into the study of religion, it really opens up. I mean, it's like Jung's famous dream of going down into the deeper layers of the psyche, right? And he first was in like the 16th century, and then he found a door, and then he goes down into deeper layers until he gets to the basement where there's this skull almost like of the original humans. And that's the way that we can excavate a text. Whereas when we're only focusing on the history and the cultural implications, we're sort of up here on the surface level, which is important. But there's ways that we can go deeper to unpack the text from deeper levels. And I think Jung's approach to the unconscious is a good way to move into that. And I'm going to use this phrase probably throughout. Nathan Schwartz-Salant, who's a Jungian analyst, talks about alchemical versus scientific thinking. And he's not saying that one is better than the other. He's saying that one has been favored, and I think we know which, over really since the Enlightenment. So we're talking about a post-Enlightenment return to what we can call alchemical thinking, which takes into account intuition, dream states, the unconscious, the body, materiality, the feminine, the earth. So we're looking at things from subjectivity, from a self-reflexive place, from a relational place, rather than from what we could refer to as the myth of objectivity. The idea that we can know something and be completely detached from it, and that's the best way to get to know something. I mean, if you were dating somebody, would you want to put them under a microscope? Would you want to take them salsa dancing? You know? So it's the same thing. Like, I see it as the same thing if we're in this hermeneutic inquiry with a text. You know, I mean, and this is why I love Jeff Kripal's work, because he talks about hermeneutics of erotics and erotic hermeneutics, that people, scholars of mysticism, having mystical experiences, studying mystical texts, which I think probably most people in here can relate to. So when we bring that piece into it, I'm not the detached, historical, objective interpreter of the text. I mean, in a certain sense, there's a lovemaking process, if we want to look at it from a much more Mediterranean lens, maybe. But so, the theoretical premise. So, I've already said a little bit about this. So, I'm looking two of the major theories here and how I've been able to do this, right, without some of the big criticisms when you're comparing religions is you don't want to be conflating traditions, right? So we don't want to just say that Indian Tantra is the same as Taoist alchemy, right? That wouldn't be a rigorous approach to comparing two different traditions or texts. So Gadamer, the German hermeneutic philosopher, has been very, very important in helping me to articulate this in a way that is sound. So for Gadamer, the importance is sort of looking at, there's eventual fusion of horizons, but we don't want to rush it. What we want to do is we want to take our time to know the horizon of the reader, which is our own prejudices and our own biases, what we're bringing to the text, and then the horizon of the text, which is the historical context. So right now, I'm here, the text is here, we're having this dance of getting to know each other. There's the interpretation of the text historically, there's my own prejudices and biases that I'm bringing to the text. And if we can hold that creative tension, there's then a fruitful hermeneutic fusion of horizons, which culminates in what he calls an excess of meaning. So we're looking at deeper and deeper layers of the text. So we can just keep going, because Jorge's going to bring a different lens to a text than I'm going to bring because of our own personal, cultural, spiritual backgrounds and biases. So if he's looking at the dark night of the soul, and I'm looking at the dark night of the soul, and then we're looking at it together, it expands it. So if we wanted to do this, we could talk for days about Spanish mysticism and the dark night of the soul, which I'm sure we could, and we'd probably both enjoy that very much. So what we're doing is trying to find as many different perspectives as possible to not try to pin or nail something down historically to feel that we finally solved it, so that we can continue this dance and this dialogue of meaning, so that we can continue to find new and different interpretive layers, right, to a text. I had the privilege of spending some time with Thomas More, who wrote Care of the Soul, and I was talking to him about this work, and we were just talking about relationships with people, and he said that for him the most important thing in the relationship between two human beings is it's not necessarily commitment, or it's not necessarily like who takes out the trash on which day. He says it's imagination. That imagination is the most important thing in a relationship between two people. And I think it's the same thing when we're interpreting texts. But it's a different kind of what we consider appropriate way to do religious studies, because it's had such a historical impetus. And there's reasons for that matter. You know, the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment critique of, for example, the Catholic Church claims to validity. The fact that male priests were the only people that could interpret texts or preach, and then opening that up post-Enlightenment to a much more interpretive lens of the people, for example, the interpretation of the Bible into the common language. That's how a lot of the historical approach grew out of. But I think that what we've lacked and what we're missing then in the last 100 or so years of hermeneutic inquiry and biblical criticism is the subjective, is the return to the personal, to the reflexive, and to the imaginal. So for me, the alchemical approach as a language of the unconscious, and this takes it to the Jungian piece, and the depth psychological interpretation, is that we want to bring back imagination. We want to bring back soul. So we want to bring soul back into the interpretive approach to text. We want to bring soul back into the study of religion. So how do we build this lens? The core is the text. The first layer, the operations of Western alchemy, which we'll look at in a minute. And then the secondary layer is the depth psychological lens. So we're really building this all one on top of each other. So what we call the fusion of horizons between the alchemical operations and the text, and then the second fusion of horizons, the depth psychological interpretation. So it's like a walnut, sort of. Only a walnut only has one shell. It's a walnut with two shells. Okay? And we all want to get at the fruit inside, but in order to get to the actual walnut, we're looking through these different lenses. And then for fun, and just because it's been very important to my own approach, a third layer is Romanyshyn's, what he's calling the transference field, which those of us that have a background in psychology know is the transference field between the therapist and the client. He's using that model to look at texts. So that's another approach. And then Jeff Kripal's approach, what he calls the hermeneutical union, which I said before, is about the experience or the relationship between scholars of religion and their texts. Why does this matter? I said a little bit about this. So the primary impetus behind developing this method for me has been the recovery of the unconscious in the field of religious studies. So that the unconscious can be something that's honored and respected in the field, both the unconscious of the author, if we could even consider the text having its own unconscious, and then also the interpretive unconscious of the person who's doing the research. Right? So there's really three layers there. And then a more integral approach to textual interpretation. So recovering the shadow of the text. What's missing? alchemy, as I said from the Golden Tablet of Hermes, is concerned not only with what's above, which was what many of our religious traditions have been concerned with, spirit at the expense of soul, the next life, or moving beyond, or disincarnating versus becoming more fully present, more fully incarnated and grounded here in this life. So an alchemical hermeneutic works with both above and below. So if we're looking at a text, for example, the Yoga Sutras, which I'll get to in a minute, the Yoga Sutras have traditionally been interpreted as a final separation or disembodiment of spirit from matter. Right? But if we look at it through an alchemical lens, we can't leave behind the body. We can't leave behind matter. So it's about working, holding these polarities, holding what Jung would refer to as the opposites, in order that a more fruitful tension or even integration can be created. So we're looking for, where's the body in the text? Where's Eros in the text? Where's the chthonic, the shadow, the underworld dimensions of the text, the power of Pluto or Hades? Where's the feminine in the text? Because in most of the spiritual traditions that we have over the last certainly 2,000 years or longer are male-dominated, in a certain sense, patriarchal traditions. So an alchemical hermeneutic returns to the other half of the soul. We're looking for these other approaches that honor dream states, the intuitive, the soul of religious studies. Some critical perspectives. People both in the field of Jungian psychology and without are both critical of Jung's approach to alchemy. So Jung's traditional understanding is that alchemy was a projection of the alchemist's own unconscious onto matter. So you have these alchemists who are working at their athenor, at their furnace, and then having these visions of dragons, or a green lion, or a small boy who's usually urinating on something. Right? So there's some crazy stuff that's going on in these visions. And Jung saw that as a projection of the psyche, as a projection of the unconscious. Now, I think that changes over time. And in his later works, he has much more of an integrated approach through his concept of synchronicity and the unus mundus, which he gets from the alchemist Gerhard Dorn. But let's stick with his initial interpretation of alchemy as a projection of the unconscious onto matter. So what does that do? Well, it limits matter. It doesn't respect the soul of the earth, the anima mundi. It doesn't respect the soul in matter, that matter can be living or is alive. So it's critiqued as being reductionistic. All right, so denying the living mystery and the reality of matter ensouled. The historical critique, people have criticized Jung that it's too internal. Jung's perspective on alchemy is too much of a, because he's an intuitive type, so we could look at it from topology too. So because Jung was such an intuitive type, that and an introvert, that's his bias, that's his lens through looking at the history of alchemy. So he actually lacks a more sensate approach to the alchemical traditions, which can deny the actual possibility that the alchemists really were maybe converting lead into gold, for example. As I mentioned, Jung's later approaches in Mysterium Conjunctionis, those of you that know his late work, I think that he moves beyond what Hillman criticized as his oppositional thinking, Jung's obsession with the opposites. I think you could read more than 4 or 5 paragraphs in Jung without him referencing something about opposites coming together or not coming together. So, but I feel that his late work starts to move beyond this with his synchronicity theory, that matter and psyche are intimately connected and intimately linked. And that's something that Marie-Louise von Franz develops and other people have developed since Jung, especially people coming from the Pacifica school and influenced by Hillman. I want to take a minute to look at the handout that I hope you have. If you don't, we only had 20 copies. There's another one up here if anybody needs one. Monica. So a piece that came up for me really since the beginning, but came up especially as I was going through the process. This is a multi-paper dissertation, so part of that is the requirement of getting 2 of the 3 chapters published. And as I went through this editorial process with the editors of the journals, one piece that continued to come up was the critique of Jung's archetypal psychology, which, as you know, is the foundation and the basis of his ontology and his epistemology, the way he looks at religion, the way that he looks at the human being. So I had to really sit with this a lot, and I don't think any of us that really want to engage, Jung critically, we have to look at this, because I think what's happened is that Jung's theory of the archetypes is outdated. And I don't think that it's, I know that it doesn't stand up to rigorous, critical inquiry, especially if we want to have a real fruitful dialogue between Jung's psychology and religious studies, for example. So Jung, the blue circle, the big blue circle, we can consider Jung's theory of the collective unconscious, which has received probably more than anything else the most criticism of his theories since he started writing about it. Jung's emphasis is on collectives. He's interested in big picture, in meta myths, and the archetypes in a certain sense become smaller because there's such a focus on universals. There's such a focus on what's cross-cultural, and there's such a focus on what can be made between my client's psyche and the ancient cult of Isis, and making these connections that many people in the study of religion would probably either laugh at or just really discount, which has happened. A different approach is Hillman's. And I think what Hillman does is in deliteralizing many of these Jungian terms, he holds them so much more loosely and returns a sense of poesis to Jung's archetypal psychology. And I think he saves it. And I really think that if we want to do a very critical dialogue and interplay between an archetypal psychology and religious studies, we have to do it through Jung's revisioning, or through Hillman's revisioning of Jung's psychology. Because for Hillman, he emphasizes specifics instead of universals. So when you look at even just the chapters of the different titles, like in his collected works, he's talking about Ares. He's talking about Dionysus. He's talking about Hecate. Right? He's talking about specifics. He's talking about gods, goddesses, usually from a Greco-Roman pantheon. He's not interested in coming up with this monomyth or coming up with this big picture scenario and then defending it, which Jung spent most of his career doing. Hillman's is much more of a relaxed approach to the archetypal theory, and in that sense I think he saves it. And it makes it much more of a fruitful dialogue when we're looking at an archetypal approach or looking at an approach that honors the unconscious, and then overlaying that or dialoguing that with religious studies. So we can talk more about this later, but I think that's important to say because that really clicked for me as a way to do legitimate and critical integral scholarship between these two fields. Hillman's has really proved indispensable in that sense. Very, very briefly, I said sort of the opening cornucopia, alchemical cornucopia at the beginning of the presentation about the different traditions. Most scholars have alchemy as originating in the first few centuries, but that's only if we're taking a Western approach, right? Alchemy is something that has come as soon as human beings began to work with the earth. I think that was an initial alchemy. As soon as people realized they could make a tool, or that there were minerals, or a gem, or anything of value that was in the earth and people started digging. I think that's the beginning of alchemy, because that's the approach, is the going in, going underground, going down, and then bringing what's down up. But then there's always a going back down, right? So it's that metaphor, that archetype of that descent, and then the resurfacing that I think is really behind the alchemical work. So later transmitted to European soil, Greek and Arab influence. Some scholars argue about the Chinese influence even on Greek alchemy. So in that sense, the term alchemy, which many scholars derive from the Arabic alchemia, which then comes from Greek,
some scholars are saying, well, it might not. There might actually be Chinese origins. So it's actually quite perfect, as Hermes is the god of alchemy. We don't even know. There's such confusion about the origins of the practices. Right? And then Kemet, from Kenya, Kemet is also a reference to the soils along the Nile. But even that piece, scholars are now contesting connections to Isis cults. So there's such beautiful mythic. I mean, this is what I mean about bringing the imaginal approach back into the historical study of even alchemy, because historians want to nail things down. But what keeps happening is they keep coming back to archetypal figures. So the origins of alchemy coming back to Hermes, right? Or the origins of Egyptian alchemy coming back to Isis. So there is this very fruitful and creative archetypal imaginal origin. The operations that I use in the study are the same as those that were outlined in Western traditions, that were not codified. They don't even have to happen in this order, necessarily, which is another beautiful piece of the welcome and invited chaos of alchemy. Rather than go through each, I will just say that they're working with elements, fire, water, air, earth, in order to transmute and circulate these materials to come to a more integrated and often embodied whole. Right? So calcination, working with fire to calcine something, to convert to lye or some sort of oftentimes reduced to an ash. Separation, to cut or to separate something that's maybe too rigid or too hard. The conjunctio, the conjunction, the bringing back together. Coagulation, making something firm, making something hard again that is maybe too soft. So you can see, if you look at these with an imaginal or an archetypal perspective, that they can be metaphors for the unconscious. And that's much more of a James Hillman's approach to alchemy rather than Jung's. Right? Hillman is holding these loosely. He's looking at the poesis in things. Jung is really trying to come up with a hard and fast approach to the psyche. And then Hillman deliteralizes this, makes it a little more fluid and playful. And then in addition to the operations, there are also stages. A blackening, a whitening, a reddening. So it's not just black or white. There's also the red. And then additional stages in between. Yellow, and then my favorite, a moment in the work when a rainbow, or what's called the peacock's tail, will sort of emerge, and you know you're on the right path. But notice the multiplicity of colors. There's a diversity here. It's not about something being one or the other. I think alchemy really balks at those sorts of, alchemical metaphor balks at those sorts of hard and fast, what we may consider scientific thinking. So alchemical thinking holds much more space for the peacock's tail, right, for the multiplicity and the diversity of perspectives. So applying the lens, the first chapter, which will be published in July in the journal Philosophy East and West, is on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and the alchemical process of individuation. And the second chapter, which is currently under a second revised review in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, of Gods and Stones, Alchemy, Jung, and the Dark Night of St. John of the Cross. And then the third chapter, which was published in December in the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies, The Alchemical Heart, a Jungian approach to the heart center in the Upaniṣads and in Eastern Christian prayer. So the Yoga Sutras. As I had mentioned, the Yoga Sutras traditionally, being that they're founded in Samkhya philosophy, which I know that all East-West psychology students know what that means, so I don't have to go into it. The basis of the Samkhya philosophy is that it's a dualistic system, that there's a separation between Purusha and Prakriti. Prakriti, which is originally seen as matter, and Purusha, which is this eternally envisioned spirit. Now, what happens later in the yogic tradition is that these terms eventually evolve into what becomes later known as Tantra. So Purusha becomes consciousness, becomes Shiva. Prakriti moves out from being this negative Maya, who's illusion, into the dance of Shakti. Right? So the earth no longer, materiality no longer becomes this negative thing to be overcome, as Tantra develops. In South Indian Tantra, they have the dance of Shiva, Nataraj. Right? This is a very different approach. The androgynous male and female Shiva is a very, very different approach than early Samkhya philosophy, which focuses on the eternal separation of Purusha and Prakriti. Now to own my own biases in this chapter comes out of my own experience with yoga practice. That for me, yoga practice is not about an eternal separation, but it's about a coming back together and a joining, a conjoining, a coming back, that there is that separatio. Yoga practice, for those of you, or even those of you who have meditate, you know that there's a separation where you're able to have a discriminative awareness of what's going on. So that's the separation between consciousness and the stuff of your life. So Purusha, witness consciousness, being able to see Prakriti, what we could interpret as the unconscious, or the stuff of my life. And what the Yoga Sutras calls the Chitta Vrittis. So Yoga Sutras define yoga as yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Right? Nirodha, which is the cessation of the Chitta Vrittis, which are the revolutions or the turnings of the mind. So the basis of the Yoga Sutras is that we want to be able to separate out, we want to be able to develop a witness consciousness to look at the turnings of our mind, our samskaras, our suffering, what we could call our personal unconscious complexes, in order to be able to see them and literally melt them. I mean, that's the language of the Yoga Sutras. It's very alchemical. We are melting down our samskaras. We are melting down Prakriti so that we can polish the mirror and see Purusha, see our eternal nature, see our God self more clearly from within without these colorings of the Chitta Vrittis. It's modern analytic psychology in a certain sense, right? But what happens is it ends there. So they have this, Patanjali talks about this concept of samyoga. Samyoga is the bind or the clouding, the enmeshment of Purusha and Prakriti. And we want to separate that out through our yoga practice. And that's the state of Kaivalya. It's an absolute liberation or separation of Purusha and Prakriti. But in my experience, and following the work of Ian Witcher, who has argued very seriously for this case, that the Yoga Sutras are actually leading towards a final integration. Now, I have to say that his work has been strongly debated by other scholars in these traditions, like Gerald Larson and other people who have really critiqued him very heavily for what could be considered a very strong eisegesis, or what he's reading into the text that might not actually be there. But approaching this from the self-reflexivity and honoring our own or my own subjective experience of this tradition, and then finding a way to articulate that through the alchemical lens, has led me to the same conclusion of Witcher, that the Kaivalya state is not an absolute separation, but maybe a final integration. So that matter and spirit are separated out, but there is no such thing as an eternal separation because they're still there. And that all we can do is see something more clearly in order to become in harmony or in relationship with it better. So it becomes a differentiated union. There is a separation, but there's still the dance. There's still the dance because it doesn't go away. There's still matter, there's still spirit, there's still consciousness, there's still unconsciousness. And so there's a differentiated union. The second article works through the dark night of St. John of the Cross, who is a Catholic Spanish Carmelite. The way that John of the Cross divides his work is that he talks about different nights of the senses. So there's an active night and a passive night to each. So an active night would be considered ascetic practices, things that we're doing to become closer to the beloved, to the divine. The passive is when the beloved does to us. So the dark night experience that he emphasizes is on the passive night of the spirit. It's when the senses, our intellect, our mind has become clouded, we cannot see, and we are being pulled into something that is beyond our willful control. This is when sort of the ground They dissolve or fall out from under us, and we do not know who we are, where we are, or where we're going. And this is, to John of the Cross, a purgative process where the purpose is to go through this dark night experience to, on the other side, similar to the Yoga Sutras, polish the mirror, that we can see that the divine is within, that we can see the truth of ourself, we can see the truth, we can see the relationship between ourselves and our beloved, our God, more clearly. But it's painful, and in a certain sense, very alchemical. So I interpret the dark night as an alchemical negredo. Right? When consciousness goes black, there is nothing to see. And I use Stan Marlin's work on the black sun a lot for this. And then following this stripping of the persona, this artificial or the superficial self, looking at the purgation, illumination, and union stages in the dark night as the negredo, the albedo, and the rubedo of Western alchemy. So looking at these different, very classical stages of Western mysticism through this alchemical lens of a blackening, the destruction, the death of certain aspects of the self, whether it's our God images or our persona, through the albedo, which is a whitening or a purificatory process, and then to the rubedo, which in John's mystical literature is the reunion with the beloved. Now what happens is there's an alchemical circulatio, so there's a repetition of these processes. It's not like you're there and then you're done. You have these moments of union, you have these moments of coming back with the beloved, maybe it's some sort of a mystical ecstasy experience, and then that's it. There always follows an experience of abandonment following the union. And this is Nathan Schwartz-Lant's work on alchemy, where he talks about the constant interplay between the conjunctio followed by negredo experiences. And he uses that in context of his clinical experiences working with his patients, but I think it works in the dark night as well, where we have purgation, illumination, purgation, union, and then oftentimes purgation again. There's never a final product. There's never a final, we're going to be together forever. Because that would not be the healthy, differentiated union. Right? That would be the collapsing of selves into more of an, what we could call, Edward Edinger calls this a lesser conjunctio. There's still more work to be done, right, to prepare for the greater conjunctio. And it's the dynamic of our relationships as well.
Amen.
The final chapter focuses on what I'm referring to as the alchemical heart. So I'm looking at the heart as an archetypal, as an alchemical center in two different traditions, two very different traditions. One is in the Indian Upaniṣads, which talks about the hridayam, the cave of the heart, entering into the cave of the heart. And then the second is in the Greek Orthodox hesychast tradition, which focuses on also the heart, both as integrative, unitive centers of the personality that are very embodied. And that's something that really draws me to these traditions in an alchemical way, is that they're both yogic in the sense that they're working with the body to churn the inner world. In the Upanishads, they talk about the original person, the first person, who's also called Purusha, the first person. And he creates the world by brooding. And the word in the Sanskrit is tapas. So Purusha does this internal tapas, or brooding, and that's how the world is created. So he stimulates this internal heat that, from the perspective of the Yoga Sutras, melts or works the chitta vrittis, and that's how we create, in a certain sense, we create matter, right? From this interplay of bringing the heat, bringing the furnace. And both traditions do this through embodied spiritual practices. The alchemical lens takes Jung's lectures on Kundalini Yoga, where he talks about the anahata, the heart center. And for Jung, he sees in the process of individuation as beginning in the heart, because we begin to develop a witness consciousness. We're not, so to speak, caught or enslaved to the lower worlds. Right? So we're not just acting out of the first three chakras. We're moving to more of an integrative center in the heart, where above and below meet. We can bring consciousness to perhaps more unconscious aspects of ourselves. And then when we hold them in the heart, from Jung's perspective, then that's where the alchemical third is born. Right? So when we have two opposites or two polarities, if we can hold those energies in a creative tension, then we have the third. And that's what Jung refers to as his transcendent function theory. That it's this very hermetic archetypal function of the psyche that can move between above and below, between consciousness and unconsciousness. And when we hold these tensions, the psyche gifts us with a third. It's a gift from the underworld, so to speak. As I mentioned, as Hermes Mercurius becomes this mediating archetypal symbol. And then my conclusion for this chapter that when we hold these opposites, that there's a birth that emerges. So in the Hesychast tradition, it's a deeper union or experience of Christ in the heart. And then in the Upanishads, it's the experience of the birth of the Purusha, right? The Purusha, or an experience of entering into the cave, recognizing the Tattvamasi, that I am that. Thou art that I am the divinity that resides within me, and the divinity resides within the heart. So further developments for the work. This is what I go through in the conclusion of the dissertation. I write about the integration of psyche and soma. So how do we bring the body back into the work? You know, the body not only in alchemy, but the body into what I'm calling the alchemical study of religion. So as I mentioned earlier, an alchemical hermeneutics searches for the shadow in a text. What is it that's missing? Right? And it's oftentimes matter, the material, the enfleshed, the somatic dimensions of spiritual practice. Jung doesn't write a whole lot about the body. What he does write is particularly interesting. Craig has challenged it and me on it being a little dualistic. But I think when we look at it from an alchemical perspective, Jung's really working and owning the fact that he has this great quote about the psyche having deep roots in the soil, and the psyche having roots in the body. You know, and that's really what I'm trying to bring to the forefront, is that there is an embodied and a somatic dimension to Jung's work that he might not have developed very strongly, but people like Marion Woodman have really made a career. I mean, the beautiful, absolutely beautiful work on bringing the body back to the forefront of a depth psychology and of an imaginal psychology. And then the other piece is what I'm referring to as dreaming the text forward. So Jung has this theory of continuing the incarnation, that our God images are not stagnant, that they're constantly evolving. His entire work, Answer to Job, speaks directly to this in the Western tradition. And that when we do work, our research, our reading, our texts, when we do this work, we can actually bring these archetypes further into an evolution. Right? So for Jung, in his Answer to Job, it's looking at the development of what he refers to as the bully of Yahweh, right, to what he sees as a development into the Christ as a much more of a loving symbol. Now, I think that there's some inherent anti-Semitism in that I won't go into right now, but and I don't think that that's a very critical approach to either of those traditions. But the idea underneath that is that the archetypes want to evolve, just like Philemon says to Jung in the Red Book, that we are real, so that there is an archetypal energy that wants to move forward. Archetypes, God images, don't want to be stuck in the past. They want to be dreamed forward. And I think through our research, we have the possibility to engage in this process. And I think that these are the most profound implications of when we're doing research with religious texts or with archetypal realities. And the piece that I really want to close on and really emphasize is how this work matters in the world. You know, yes, there's the depth psychological piece, which I think is very important and connected to this. You know, I think we do have the responsibility to dream these texts and these archetypes forward. But I think that the way that this happens, or the implications beyond the written page, like the way that this happens and what this looks like in the world, is that our oceans burned in this millennium. The Gulf was on fire. There's a giant ocean of plastic in the Pacific. Like, when we don't honor the material, when we don't see that the earth is sacred, this is the direct result. When our culture tells us that black bodies don't matter, this is the result. When we have a culture that privileges whiteness and white consciousness over anything that is black or of the shadow, this is what happens. And when we don't honor the feminine and view women's bodies as sacred, this is the result. So we have had 2,000 years of patriarchal religion. And an alchemical approach to the study of religious texts brings us back to the body. It brings us back to the earth as sacred. It brings us back to the experience of the feminine and women as central to an embodied reality of the divine. But the only way that we can get to this is to descend. The only way out is down. And it's a dark path. But I think this is the work that we're called to do. And for me, these are, when we take this alchemical hermeneutic, as abstract or as specific to the world of academia it may be, I think these are the furthest implications that we draw. So I want to thank my committee again. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to everybody who has held me throughout this process.
Thank you, David, for this really inspiring presentation. We're going to proceed with the committee's comments and questions. And Peter, I normally invite our external leader to go first. Are you ready to comment on the work briefly and maybe ask David a couple of questions?
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, as David already knows, I think it's an absolutely deeply engaging and fascinating work. As I read my way through it in its final incarnation, so many thoughts came to me, so many questions. And I have a long list of them here. There's probably not enough time for the little slot that I have to ask these questions. So I'll just get to the ones that really are pressing upon me most of all, and I think it's just because of the nature of my own work and my own practice and what I'm trying to make sense out of now. So I guess I'd like to begin. I sort of latched onto the revisioning of religious studies in the title of the work, David. And one of the things I'm always thinking about is the future of religion as a category, as an experience, and recognizing that this category of religion is a totally Eurocentric Western construct. So how do you think this kind of work, in addition to revisioning religious studies, helps to revision religion in and of itself?
Thank you for asking the largest and most challenging question possible.
Start with the easiest.
Well, you know, we'll start big and work our way down.
So alchemy was an underground tradition. It wasn't a religion. Jung looks at alchemy as an undercurrent of dominant Christianity, at least in its European medieval expressions. So I think in a certain sense, there's and this is completely my own postmodern perspective. I think that there's a certain deviance, and I think that there's a certain insubordinate approach if we want to look at alchemy in relation to the study of religions. Because it was something that was underground and even persecuted and mocked, and like the Philosopher's Stone, could be considered the least
like the cornerstone that the builders rejected, right? So there's a certain hiddenness latent just in Western esotericism as a whole, that it is not the dominant tradition. It is not the voice of the institution. It is not the voice of the dominant religious perspective. So in that sense, it exists as a challenge, and as Jung would say, it exists as a compensation. So I think that what alchemy can do is it can offer a critical perspective, which I hope I've articulated in my own way, to the study of religion in a deconstructionist perspective. I think that's it. I think alchemy can have a deconstructionist role when we're, a field, right? Like you're saying, a field, or calling something, it creates a citadel, it creates a tower, right? I'm thinking of the card in the tarot, of the tower, right? But what happens to the tower when it becomes too ossified is that it needs to get struck by lightning so it can be deconstructed, so there can be a renewal process. And I think that that's the basis and the emphasis of alchemy. For example, the constant emphasis on the death of the king. There's always a king that's dying in some alchemical text. So if the king is an ossified form of ego consciousness, which I think religious studies can and has become in a lot of ways, alchemy can offer a perspective of really annihilating that sense of consciousness and recrafting something that holds itself a little less loosely and can approach things from more of a poetic rather than a literalistic or solely historical perspective.
Well, let me just press you on this a little more.
Please.
Okay, and I'll give you just a little bit more information to go with. So one of the things that I think about a lot is, given we are now living in such an interconnected, rapidly globalizing world that has all of its blessings and its curses that come along with it. An argument has been made by some scholars, futurists particularly, that the age of us saying, I am a Christian, or I am a Buddhist, or I am a Jew is over, at least in terms of religion. And that instead, we kind of have to view this category that we call religion as, and this is Foucault's example, a toolbox that, and Bob Orsi, who I know you're familiar with, he has also made this argument that it's no longer a question of I am this religion versus that religion, but rather that all of these religious traditions, their practices, their theologies, their cosmologies, these are now resources for a globalized humanity to draw on as they need them, whether that's in terms of theory or practice. How does the work that you have done support that idea or challenge it?
Well, I think that's the beauty of, that is one of the positives and the beauty of Jungian psychology, is that I think it liberates people. I mean, Jung said that his psychology was not for people that were believing or practicing of a tradition because their religion was working for them. They didn't need a Jungian approach because Jung said in the end of things, his approach was for people that were looking for a sense of meaning, and Jung thought that religion was a path to do that. Like Jung's psychology is a religious psychology in that sense, right? I think the importance of Hillman's revisioning of Jung's psychology is that he expands it beyond that sort of, Hillman is postmodern in that sense, that I think he speaks directly to what you're saying, and so in this sense I support that a polytheistic, global, multicultural approach to the psyche is emancipatory in the sense that it allows us to find meaning and to speak to truths that emerge from within. So, Craig is very intimate with Sophia in many ways, as he's shared, right? Other people have an intimacy with different archetypes or different figures in a way that is not culturally specific. So
because I come from, as you know, a very rich Italian Catholic heritage, you know, what am I doing, you know, when I was 26 years old, committing my life to Shiva? So I think this is what you're saying, you know, and an archetypal approach to the study of religion, or even the personal and spiritual practices within the religion, I think archetypal psychology supports that, because it gives us a framework of how to work with people. You know, for those of us that are interested in doing ministry or spiritual counseling or pastoral counseling with people, I think it's a way to make sense of and to expand our pantheon, so to speak, so that if someone's Christ is not speaking to them in a certain sense, that, which I think is happening for many people, it doesn't mean that religion is bankrupt, or that the religious function of the psyche all of a sudden, you know, doesn't matter, you know, or because I think there's still a richness and an importance to religion. It just needs to be reframed along the lines of what you're saying, that it is much more multicultural and global. So I support that.
All right, thank you. Next sort of challenge in the best sense of the word, not in an adversarial way whatsoever.
Please.
So you have termed this project a theoretical work, right? So I'm thinking of particularly good old Evagrius Pontus, right, who says, "He who is a theologian prays, and he who prays is a theologian." So I want to sort of extrapolate from that and kind of get anthropological about it. So she who is a theoretician practices, and she who practices is a theoretician, right? And we now have going on the sort of fringes of the discipline of anthropology, where I think I would presently locate myself, this notion that participation observation, this idea that you could actually go out and do field work and sort of be this disincarnate, disembodied intellect that's observing everything while you're acting like you're participating is crap, plain and simple. And that instead, the new model is participation comprehension. So let's use as an example my work in the voodoo tradition in the diaspora. So I can only write about what it means to have a spirit, one of the voodoo spirits, take up residence in my body if I have had that experience, if I have opened myself up to that experience. We used to call that, back in the 1960s and 70s, going native, with quotes, please. And that was the worst thing that you can do. Poor Carlos Castaneda was vilified for going native. He was discredited as an anthropologist for going native. And now, in certain circles of anthropology, it's the only way that meaningful research can be done. And with the understanding that we anthropologists are not scientists, we are not delivering the objective truth with capital T. The best that we can do is render an interpretation based on our experiences and in conjunction with that what others have told us. So can you think about what you have done along those lines, as opposed to that it's just theoretical?
Because theoria in the Greek tradition is contemplation.
Right.
And it's contemplation of a mystery, of a living mystery. So for me, this work has been about a participation in that mystery. And so from that perspective, it hasn't been theoretical in the sense that I've just been sitting around thinking completely isolated analytical thoughts that have no correlation to my own personal or spiritual life. You know, and if I was to locate myself in this work, which is important, and I think that's what you're asking me to do, you know, this journey has been my own journey. And the approach to the body and the approach to sexuality and the redemption of eros that I'm arguing for and theoretically crafting, this is about my own recovery. This is about my own recovery and integration of my own spirit with my own sexuality, and my own heart center with my own eros. To not leave any aspect of myself behind, but to bring everything together so that there isn't a disembodied, quote-unquote objective, quote-unquote theoretical mouthpiece that's extrapolating or theorizing, but that, I mean, we need to reattach testicles to the study of religion. And more important than that, ovaries. Thank you. And the vagina, and all other parts of a human being that are part of any study of anything. Whether it's Haitian voodoo, or alchemy, or plant medicine, or whatever. I mean, we do this work with a body. And we've been pretending since the dawn of the birth of these disciplines 100 or so years ago that there isn't one. That it's an objectively detached sort of Kantian enlightenment mind that can look at something and claim to know it. And how could I claim that if my own flesh isn't included in the hermeneutic circle of things?
Okay, good. Thank you. I have just two more questions. So I'm sort of speed dating text right now. And this is about the whole hermeneutic, going off of Jeff Kripal's idea, which you have elaborated upon and I think developed more in this work. So I'm sort of speed dating text. I'm looking at all these texts. I'm not connecting to them. I'm looking for something to read. Nothing's happening. I use the word speed dating because, it's sort of like when you have to move around those tables quickly, ask as many questions as you can, figure out whether you want to exchange phone numbers and take it from there. So, is the problem that my unconscious is not connecting up with the unconscious of the text? If when I pick up a text and I start reading it, or I start forcing myself to at least read 3 chapters of a 12-chapter book, and I'm constantly saying, you know what, this is not working, is it because the transference process is not happening, or is it because I have some kind of block and there's a door there that I don't want to open? What do you think is going on there based on your project and the arguments that you've made about the relationship between a reader of a mystical text and the texts themselves?
Yeah. Well, the nature of the transference isn't something that can be created, right? It's something that there's a mysterious third that has to be there. Anybody that's had a therapist that's just been a dud, you just don't have a connection with, that. Or anybody that's been speed dating and, 80% of the people you don't have a connection with, there just isn't that erotic transference. There isn't the juice between the two. And I think it's the same thing with the text. So if somebody came to me with that sort of an inquiry, I would say, well, maybe the answer is to actually to put the books away and to go within and to see what, in a true archetypal or Jungian or Hälmanian sense, what wants to emerge from within? What's the organic juice that's already there? What's the relationship or the relational encounter that's waiting to be uncovered? It doesn't have to be between a person and a text. It's between the person and their own, their own soul. And I think this goes back to what you're saying about what does it look like to be religious today. I'm not saying that only internal introverted experiences matter, but it's certainly making a comeback, that a person can have a personal relationship. And the evangelicals have been saying this for how long? Emphasizing the personal relationship with Jesus, right? I have a personal relationship with Shiva. I also have a personal relationship with Dionysus. I have a personal relationship with a lot of, a lot of these archetypal figures. And not all of them are contingent on the text. I read the text because it helps me to get to know them better. Jorge gave me the time's up though. Do we want to move on, or?
Maybe one, if it's quick.
Do you have a briefer question?
Yeah, just one more, and I just also want to make one comment. I really appreciated at the end your sort of mentioning the privileging of white male consciousness over black consciousness, over women's consciousness. I would like to encourage you to also consider the privileging of heterosexuality over other forms of sexuality as part of that analysis. And you mentioned a few times that Jorge's question to you is, so what? So my parting question to you is, so now what?
Can I refrain from answering that right now? Well, I mean, one piece, just if there's many different directions that this sort of a hermeneutic can go. I focused specifically on the operations, the alchemical operations, but you could do an alchemical hermeneutic based on sulfur, or salt, right, or mercury, or for that sake, urine or feces, which has such a pivotal role in a lot of alchemical texts. I mean, you could look at a text from any variety. That's why alchemy is such a rich tradition to do this sort of hermeneutic from, because it offers so many, such like a myriad of lenses. So in that sense, the so what is that I think there's a lot of other ways that this approach could be developed. You're probably asking me something that's much more concrete and material about what next, and I'm just not prepared to answer that at this moment. So. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your very thoughtful questions, and I'll pass the word to Craig.
I have a couple of questions, but before I get to him, I just wanted to say how much I always enjoy your embodied approach to scholarship. It's enlivening to hear it and participate in it. It's wonderful. And I loved how interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, to put it a little differently. For some people, it seems to mean something like smashing traditions together, and you're putting them more in conversation, which I appreciate. And it's a critical conversation, which is great. I like how you have so many different levels to what you're doing, the cultural, the historical, the spiritual, the philosophical, and you get those all talking to each other. That's great. I love that in your dissertation too. And then the humor that you bring into all of this, it's awesome. The two questions I have, I want you to think on your feet a little bit about this. They're implicit in your work, but they're not explicit in it. So you've mentioned some really, what would be a good word? Some ongoing, but also recent critiques of Jung and his work and his take on alchemy and psychic process. And you've mentioned that in some ways Hillman is a better fit. The question I want, or what I'd like you to do a little bit of anyway, is I want you addressed some of the shadow parts of Jung really well and the things where he falls short. Where does Hillman fall short as a lens with this work?
We do it one at a time. I thought you were going to give me both questions.
No,
Hence the on my feet. It's hard to say that this is a shadow of Hillman, because I think he would own this outright. But I think Hillman's approach and his role, what has been his role, is to turn everything that Jung says upside down on its head. So I think that they have a compensatory relationship between each other in that sense. That the one real, actual, what I would say would be a scholarly critique of Hillman is that in his entire volume of alchemical psychology, he really doesn't challenge, he really assumes Jung's alchemical psychology. I mean, he treats it differently, but it's not until, at least Bosnak and later, more current Pacifica depth archetypal folks, I think they're the ones who are really talking about the unus mundus in in a very profound way, and really the soul, like the interconnection between psyche and matter. But in Hillman, I don't know if he, at least not that I've seen in his alchemical psychology, I don't know if he really goes there. It seems to be a piece of his work that's still relatively conservative and true to what Jung says. So I would say that Hillman doesn't actually really develop Jung's alchemical psychology. And feel free, to disagree if there's things that I haven't seen, but I mean, in what I've read by Hillman, he doesn't. There's even one part in one chapter of that piece of his uniform edition where he just says that Jung's basic approach was projecting matter onto, or the projection of the alchemist onto matter, and then he just keeps going. He doesn't even actually critique it. Like, he just assumes it and builds upon it and revisions it and treats it a little more poetically. But in what I've read of Hillman, he actually doesn't do what Bosnak and what later people are doing. So I think that would be my critique of Hillman's approach.
Good, yeah, thank you. Incidentally, on the first part of what you said about turning stuff upside down, one of the last occasions I talked to Hillman, I said, sometimes when I read your work, you strike me as being kind of the Nietzsche of depth psychology, because you like to just come up to things and flip them over to see what's going to happen. And he laughed. He thought that was hilarious. He's like, I like Nietzsche. So anyway, yeah, he would own that. Yeah. My second question is, in terms of alchemy itself, the Western variety. So traditionally, if you go way back, and I'm using Western in quotes because it's when you, as you mentioned in your presentation, when you get into supposedly Western alchemy, you have to go to Persia and China and Egypt and places like that, But in terms of the basic phases or colors, for a long time, alchemy said there's the blackening, the three that you mentioned, and you mentioned the yellowing too. There's the blackening phase where everything is torn up and deconstructed. There's the albedo where things come back to life a little bit. And then there's the reddening at the end, so the attainment of the Philosopher's Stone and all that. But so there was blackening, whitening, and between whitening and reddening, there used to be the citronatus, the yellowing stage, And then around the 1500s, it drops out of alchemy. So my question for you is, why? Why do you think that is, if you would speculate a little bit?
Well, I mean, Hillman has a whole chapter on that, and I don't want to plagiarize him, but...
Aside from what you think.
Yeah. I think when we look at histories of religious and philosophical systems, things tend to get streamlined over a period of time. Now, the modern complexity theory would disagree with that, but I think that when we look at certain things, like the purgation, illumination, union, like things don't happen that easily, right? But I think things like to get streamlined as things get, as a Western male consciousness usually likes to bring reason and analysis to things. But as far as from more of the archetypal approach, yellowing is a paling. It's a paler approach. It's a paling in coloring. It makes me think of almost like a putrefaction or a putrefactio, where things are. It's like a decompositional aspect, but then I also think of. I'm thinking of what I've just recently read about. I recently read a really great interpretation of urine by Marie-Louise von Franz, because this is what I do for fun.
Everybody needs a hug.
One of the things that Marie-Louise von Franz says about urine is that it's the only part of the human organism that we can't control. We cannot eat. We can hold our breath, at least for a while. There's lots of things that the will of the human body can control. But try not peeing. So she connects that to almost. She says this. This is in her interpretation of the golden ass, the myth of Upaniṣads. So she says that so urine is closely connected to the gods because it's something that has a will over us. I don't know how that relates to your question. I have to tell you. And that if there is a fall, like, if there, and there is a falling away of the yellowing, and without, on the fly, being able to do more research into the actual alchemical processes of the yellowing, which I didn't focus on in the dissertation, without doing that, I wonder if there's a sense of, I don't want to say like a deliberate, I'm not gonna say here that there's a deliberate hiding, but I think there's a way that things are concealed, and certain practices and things become concealed or tend to fade away. Even things that are really valid and important and that need to be recovered. So I don't know. I don't really have unfortunately, I don't have a straight up historical like. I'm coming from much more a poetic approach rather than a historical consciousness, but. I don't know. I don't know. You got me.
I appreciate hearing you think out loud about it, though.
Yeah, I think in that, because we don't really have historical documents, at least that I know, that say, well, this is why we don't do this anymore.
Yeah.
So I think it demands a certain poetic or metaphorical appreciation of the process.
Yeah. So just a quick, not even a question, but a comment. It'd be interesting going forward to see what happens with your work if you bring the yellow back in. Yeah. So, thank you.
Appreciate that.
If I can move out of my putrefaction state.
Yeah. Thank you for being here.
Coagulate some questions for you. The first thing I want to do is appreciate what just happened right now here. That is, I take as a sign of a scholarly maturity to answer to a question saying I don't know, and I really want to appreciate what just happened in this moment, because very often scholars, and especially public speaking, and in a dissertation defense, is still this kind of need that you need to answer everything, and if you don't know the answer, you make one up. Say you don't know, and I think
I did talk about urine.
I think everybody appreciated the discourses, as well as I'm sure everybody appreciated you're coming back to, I don't know, answer that question. So thank you. And yes, I think it's a great work what you produce. As you know, I teach theoretical research, and one of the main things I try to teach is like to find like a good productive fit, between lenses and text, And I think your work is exemplar in that way, You really, you not only found us productive fit those selected texts that your lenses brought clear fruits to, but also you did something else that is beyond the call of duty, that is to create a very powerful lens, that becomes effort, So you really put together Romanyshyn and Jungian alchemy and Kripala, and you build like these really powerful lenses through which to look at particular religious texts, and I think that's an accomplishment. In a way, it's a method that it may be used by others. It's a huge contribution. So thank you for that. And that kind of brings me. I also wanted to congratulate you for your speaking skills. You're a great presenter. So I'll leave it there. I think you have a teaching career if you want to move in that direction waiting for you. Like you're such a natural speaker. But let me go back to this comment about like your selected text. There is a way in which the only change I may ask you to do, in addition to small typos, is actually the title. As I was listening to this again today, and it didn't come up for me before, but the subtitle is Revision Religious Studies Through a Jungian Lens. It feels the religious studies is huge. It's huge. It's like a huge field with many goals, and I think that the lens you have constructed, you identified very clearly that it's for a select number of people texts dealing with stages and states of transformation of consciousness, and that's a very limited area within the religious studies. So I wonder if like a change of subtitle could be more honoring what the work is really about, more concrete, but also less this may be ambitious, or the lens size is huge, and we don't know, you haven't demonstrated that the lens is operable for the whole field, you know. So what about something like re-envisioning transformation of consciousness into religious states through Jungian lenses? Something like that. We can talk more. But for my first question, or my first common question, I have just two. And the first is this. You identify that this lens is especially functional for spiritual texts dealing with, excuse me, the states and the stages of transfer of consciousness in religious states. And I agree that it's a powerful way, you know, like the alchemical operations, the stages, they do speak to many of these states. But my question would be, do you think there's an exception for that? Are there descriptions of spiritual stages or states that you find that alchemical hermeneutics and alchemical lens may not be such a fertile tool, hermeneutically speaking? Another way to talk about this is like, what's the shadow of alchemical hermeneutics? What any lenses allow us to see some things and prevent us to see others, you know. So what is missing that we cannot see when we put on alchemical hermeneutic lenses, you know? So that's kind of my first question.
So alchemy, in that it works with matter, has a specific goal that's both material and spiritual. It's an integrated product that they refer to as a philosopher's stone. And I frame that in different ways, whether it's the birth of a new God image, or a more integrated heart center. But in traditions, specifically non-dual traditions, where the emphasis is not on a particular, I mean, it's a state, but it's a non-state, right? So with something like Vedanta, or like Shankaracharya, like when the final realization is that there isn't a self. Buddhist practices where they don't, where the self is something to be deconstructed, that there isn't even a concept of a self, even at a psychological, much less at a transpersonal level. So what would alchemy have to say to that? And I don't think that an alchemical hermeneutic, as I'm developing it, would certainly not deny the validity of that. But I think what it would challenge is, well, where's the body in that? Because that's the whole critique with the samadhi in the Yoga Sutras and the nirva, like the very end stages of samadhi, where it's sort of the way that it's spoken about is that it's just this sort of eternal ecstasy, but you're still alive, right? So even if we're in this state of samadhi where we're out of our body, or we're in some sort of state of union state, we still have a body. So what's it doing? You know, I think it was, God, I can't remember now if it was Jim Ryan here or if it's Ian Witcher. Somebody talks about the idea of like samadhi on the beach, where it's just this idea that like, somebody writes about this. This phrase of samadhi on the beach, where it's like when you get to this state, and you're just like, it's like, well, you're just on the beach. You're just chilling for the rest of your life. And I don't know if it's that easy, because we still exist in this realm. So I think the alchemical piece would critique that, but at the same time, so it would be able to be in conversation with non-dual texts or with Buddhist texts like that, but it might not be as fruitful a lens with which to interpret.
Yes, that's good. That's good. That's what I had in mind. Very connected to it, I had in mind like the whole sudden versus gradual approaches to enlightenment, for example.
Yeah.
You know, like alchemical lenses like can help, you know, all these stages and maps of consciousness through gradual approaches. But what about traditions that say it's coming Hebrew, you know, and that's it, you know? What all this is like, they would consider it completely irrelevant.
Yeah, like Satori experiences,
Yeah.
Zen states.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And of course that coincides also with the whole debate in transpersonal theory that we discussed, you and I, Wasborn, Wilber, you know, like a lot of these words, like kind of the Jungian example, the descent, you know, and like reunion in a higher level, you know, and Wilber talks about developing in a different way, you know? So that's, anyway, for further thought there.
Yeah.
My second and last, and we'll probably end a bit later because we started a bit later, and hopefully you guys can stay maybe 5-10 more minutes. My second has to do with the whole question about when we discuss this in our conversations about exegesis and eisegesis in hermeneutical work, and in particular, with your work with Patañjali and Yoga Sūtras and Witcher, and sometimes I was kind of like finding myself, and is there a tension here between those two, between saying this is my creative hermeneutical reading on this, or not, and I don't think the tension is there. I think you are very careful saying like, well, when read from an alchemical hermeneutic perspective, the Yoga Sutras, but then I was wondering like, how would you respond, and I'm engaging you as a colleague, okay? How would you respond to a more traditional scholar telling you like, okay, that's very nice, if you look at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras from this alchemical perspective, you can make that point that you're making, but I'm not that interested in that. What I'm interested is in what Patanjali said, what Patanjali's point was in that time, and why should be interested in what these lenses bring forward today, And the related comment or question comment here is like, you mentioned too, like that part of this approach comes from your own experience, of the practice of yoga, and I think I Am Witcher's work emerges from that too.
He's also a practitioner scholar.
Yes, so, but what is very clear today from students of yoga and the evolution of yoga is the yoga that is practiced today super different than what Patanjali was talking about, And actually, I don't know if you know the book by Singleton on
Mark Singleton.
the yoga body, the origins of. So I mean, the yoga that we practice today seems to have much more to do with European gymnastics of women than Patanjali Yoga Sutras. So of course, and someone would say, of course, like the experience of yoga is different than what Patanjali taught. Wow, because it's a different thing. I mean, we're talking about different practices, even we're using the same word. So I don't know if there's a question behind this thing, but I just wanted to bring this to you and see how you engage.
Yeah. Well, do you want me to specifically respond to the Yoga Sutras piece, or is
Be my guest.
Okay. Well, the issue with the Yoga Sutras piece is that it's not a whole document. It's many documents that have been compiled into one, so that the asana practice might not have anything to do with the final samadhi states, right? So it's really, in a certain sense, it's like the word that's coming is like a palimpsest. Like there's many layers and voices, like reading the Hebrew scriptures. The different, the Yahwist and the Elohim accounts. Like there's many people talking about this one God called Yahweh, right? And it's very similar in the Yoga Sutras. There's many people. There's many voices that we don't know that are describing states that we don't necessarily understand. Part of it, going back to what Peter said, because none of us have had the experience, because we're not the authors and we weren't living in that time. So that in itself is the crux of the issue of doing any sort of interpretation.
Excellent.
So there's that one piece. And then the other is like the much broader, I'm sorry, I'm just blanking right now.
The exegesis, yes.
About the exegesis piece.
Yeah.
And I think so that's why there needs to be what I'm hoping to do is articulate a rigorous and critical archetypal approach to depth psychology, to religious studies, and by archetype I'm not focusing on that on the term archetype as much as I am the method, like people like Coppin and Nelson, that people are developing, out of Pacifica and the work that they're doing, that there's a whole methodology behind in archetypal psychology, and that's what I'm really focusing on. That there has to be room for creative eisegesis. Like there has to be room for it in religious studies or in any field. Like there has to be room for it, because it's such an integral part of being a human being. And it doesn't mean that I'm making up things that Patanjali did or didn't say. It's naming what he said to the best of my ability, but then saying, maybe let's go here. Maybe let's look at it from this perspective. It's the piece that's been missing. And I know, like Peter said, it's coming back into religious studies, and even in the world, I feel like I've sort of bashed like the history of Christian spirituality a little bit, but there's people like the Journal Spiritus and Douglas Burton Christie. I mean, there's people that are already doing this and bringing their own self-reflexivity into the more broader field of religious studies. And to speak to your point about the title, I mean, that's part of why
that part is important to me because I'm speaking to how we do a study of something. Like it's specifically focusing on the hermeneutic inquiry and investigation into religious studies as a field. You know, and that's what I want to focus on. And how do we bring imagination back into this, you know, into a field that in many ways has become so scientifically developed.
Yeah. Just one comment, and then we'll move forward. I mean, some scholars would go even farther and say like that kind of creative reading is not only important, it's inevitable, right? I mean, that's the crux of the argument from Gadamer to Undertag to Kruipal, is like there is no other way to interpret but creatively reading into it, you know, and so there are things like this delusional patriarchal objectivity, you know, that doesn't really exist, you know. So that's great. Maybe we can talk about the title at the end. Maybe there is something you can include there. It's in the study of, I don't know, it seems to me it's the religious studies. It's very big. Oh, yeah. It's very big for what the work, you know. So we can talk about that. I don't have any more questions, but I wonder if either Craig or Peter, is there anything else you would like to say before we move outside and we'll call you on the phone and we deliver as we leave David with the audience?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Me too.
Yeah, good. Great. So maybe, I don't know if someone can help us to disconnect Peter from here so we can call him. And during this time that we are going to be awake. I'm not awake. Please engage David with your questions, comments, praise, criticism, anything. I mean, if you can take anything, you can give him, probably. So please don't get shocked.
Bill.
I'm just really blown away, David. I really appreciate, remembering you when we first met and how you've grown and matured and evolved and everything. So, bravo. My question is really not so terribly esoteric. You had this guy named Weicker, you said?
Witcher, Ian
Witcher?
Yeah, Witcher.
So, what book was that?
It's called The Integrity of the Yoga Darshana.
Okay.
It's very good. It's very philosophical, but his argument is that, like I said, it's really about integration rather than separation in the yoga tradition. Hence the title, The Integrity of the Yoga Darshana.
Okay. How do you spell Ian?
I-A-N.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hope that was easy enough.
Thank you. It's the best question I've had. Yeah. Hey, Ken.
All right. So I actually thought that I was coming here for you, but I'm here for me. That was amazing. I learned so much. It was really, really beautiful. So thank you for sharing that. I was wondering, what are your ideas for taking just this idea out of academia and into the world? Like, how do you do that? How do you take something that is so, I don't have the words for it, something that's so vast and complex and rich and deep and soulful into a world where people are, focusing on a soundbite or, having a coffee with somebody and looking, instead of the person looking at their computer, do you have any idea of how to do that?
Some of you were in the Janice Phelps seminar, the Transformative Practices seminar, and the first time that I ever developed this was the very, very beginning. Like, I actually led people through like an alchemical body practice, and I used the different operations from the alchemical work to lead people through different embodied experiences. So I did this sort of like alchemical yoga hybrid, and it was fun, and I had no idea what I was doing. And that was actually some of the feedback I got from that seminar. Like, so I was trying to integrate that with what I was only just starting to develop here, and somebody in the seminar said to me afterwards, I really like this. I don't know what you're talking about, but it's really cool. But I think that's because at that phase of the work, it was such an intuitive seed. Like I had an intuition, and I had to write my way into what I was saying, and that was really hard, because like I was part of this process. I had to do I had to get them published. So it wasn't just that I was working with Peter and Craig and Jorge. I then had to work with 3 different journals, juried journals, and at least 3 to 6 editors for each journal. So a lot of these chapters I rewrote 6 times. Like not just, you know, for them, but for and through that process I was able to come more into a sense of what it was. But it really started as just a very intuitive seed. But anyway, to answer your question, like it started out as a very embodied approach to working with people's bodies. You know? So I don't want to lose that. I mean, I don't think I have lost that, but it's not just an academic thing for me. You know? It's always been a hybrid. It's always been about both. Thank you.
So, that was an amazing presentation. So it was such a pleasure to watch you really embody your scholarship, and it's interesting, right? Like because a lot of the times when we start talking about theory, we think it's separate from the body and the soul, and in some ways what you're doing here is again instantiating like that they're not separate, that text and theory can embody and be imbued with soul. And it's like it's reminding me of all the ways in which we're taught, like even here at CIS, these dualities and these binaries exist, right? Like stop paying attention to your books, go out and read, or go out and play, or you know. That's something we're taught as children, and then and as we grow into scholars, these binaries keep replicating themselves. And in some ways, you're reminding us through this presentation that these binaries are not that you can dream into, through, bring your body and soul, all of that, right? Like, so that was a great presentation. Thank you for that. And one question I found myself having was, you're also reminding us to bring back the feminine, right? One of the things you're reminding us that we need to bring back into scholarship is the feminine. And I found myself wondering, where are the women scholars in your, I mean, you named Marian Woodman as one scholar, and you may have other scholars in your list of references, and maybe it's a limited way of approaching scholarship, is it? Like, I'm like holding the question right now, like if somebody is building your corpus of arguments, if somebody is taking you towards where you need to go in constructing your scholarship, or taking you through the alchemical stages, does it matter? Does the gender matter? Like, does the sexuality matter? Does the race matter? Like, does the race, color, gender of the scholar matter at all?
We're entering into the room right now,
Well, I think that's all.
and we'll try to use my phone. If not, we'll use
You want to call him again?
let's see this.
Just call him.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear from here, or?
Peter, I'm just gonna call you again, Peter. So, Monica, just to speak to your question, like I think it's twofold. One is that's why the self-reflexivity piece is so important, and that we need, in general, just more women who are scholars in the field of religion, and not just approaching things from a more of what we could consider a patriarchal approach to how we've all been taught to do religious studies, which is really just with our minds.
Sorry.
Hey, it's okay.
The cursor was missing. Love technology.
All right, I'm finishing responding to a question, and then we'll go wherever you guys want to go.
Yes.
Okay. So I think the self-reflexivity piece is really important, and then the other piece is that we just have different approaches to doing religious studies, and that already exists. I mean, it's called feminism, and I'm not an expert in that field, but even within the field of feminism, even that's a very different approach, to religious studies texts, and even that might not necessarily be an imaginal or intuitive or embodied approach, and I think it just this generally speaking to a shift in how we live with these texts and traditions. You know, I don't know if that.
We'll talk more.
Okay, we'll talk more.
Great, thank you for being here again. And so we talked outside with David and Craig, and we not only unanimously agreed that this dissertation passes, but with the three of us, we wish we had here at CIS a category that other universities have, that is to pass a dissertation with distinction. We feel that this dissertation deserves to be passed with distinction, not only because of the scholarly work on here, but your professional demeanor, and also because you publish these chapters in some journals, some of which are very prestigious, like Philosophy and West, which is kind of the foremost journal in comparative philosophy. So congratulations, Dr. Odorisio.
Congratulations, doctor. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yes.
Talk to you soon.